Hi, I'm Ben Esters, and my theme is teaching diverse learners, specifically addressing the needs of multicultural students. I chose this theme because I'm very passionate about working with students from different cultures, as well as in my experience working with students through my practicum and student teaching. I realize that there's a large, diverse group of students who are underrepresented and need to be kind of reached out to in different ways. So I really wanted to research and kind of understand how to work with those types of students. My competency statement is, I am competent at creating a classroom and lessons that address my students' cultures so that they may feel a sense of belonging in an inclusive classroom. What I mean with my competency statement is I really want my students to feel included. I want them to feel like they're able to use their voice as well as use their form of communication best so that they're able to explain where they come from. I want them to feel like their voice is equal and as heard as another student's culture in the classroom. That brings me to my questions. I included all 4 questions of teaching diverse learners in my capstone, but I want to kind of stress 2 specific ones. I really want to talk about which students might a teacher be missing and why. How will the teacher know if he or she is missing the learners? What knowledge, skills, or strategies can a teacher use to help these learners? And then I also want to talk about how should research on multiple aspects of diversity, i.e. race, ethnicity, different socioeconomic status, influence a teacher and how they should work with his or her craft. My first piece of evidence is my math lesson from Math Block 2014. We included a gearing up and gearing down section in our math lessons, but I want to use this as kind of a baseline of what I could have done better and how I've grown from there. So this baseline is a lesson over how to use numbers, partners, 2 through 6, as well as developing spatial concepts for kindergartners. In the gearing up section, I addressed kind of students who might find the lesson too easy. So I included a section where they might be able to work with a student who is struggling with it, or they might be asked more critical questions so they could think a little bit deeper about the concept. I also included a gearing down section where the students who were struggling with it would work with a student who was doing a little bit better at it, but would be able to help them, as well as kind of more simplified questions so that they would really understand it. I really enjoyed using the gearing up and gearing down ideas in my lesson plan, but it also gave me the chance to be intentional with my teaching of cultural students, but I missed that chance. I missed the chance to work with students who had maybe a language barrier, or missed the chance to work with a student who had another cultural barrier that could have influenced their learning more appropriate, or it could have been more appropriate for them to have a certain instructional strategy had I included it in the lesson. I want to use it as a baseline because in this lesson I really didn't include a part where I worked with diverse learners. From there I want to show how I've grown from it. My next example is thematic unit from my literacy block, the spring of 2015. In our literacy block, we had to come up with a thematic unit where we talked about different literary strategies in another subject. So my thematic unit is about living and non-living things, as well as plant life and what a plant looks like. In the lesson, we had to come up with 6 different days worth of lesson plans, and each lesson had certain parts that you had to include, and part of the lesson was meeting the needs of diverse learners. So this really gave me the chance to be intentional of creating a lesson that worked with the needs of my diverse students. It gave me the chance to think of which instructional strategies and which teacher behaviors I needed to use in my classroom to say work with a student who had an ELL barrier, or work with a student who had a socioeconomic barrier. It gave me the chance to be intentional in my thought of my lesson plan to teach another student from another culture. While I was able to utilize it somewhat, I didn't do a really great job of being intentional with it. I still failed to meet all the needs of all of my ELL students. I still failed to meet the needs of another student who might have another cultural barrier. This was my first step of being intentional about it, but I could have been a lot more intentional about it had I given more thought and research into how to work with students from different culture. So that kind of brings me to my third piece of evidence, which are some articles that I looked up. I realized that throughout my teaching and throughout my my practicum experiences, I really hadn't researched or gone deep into what I could do as a teacher to kind of grow in working with cultural students. So I wanted to look up different articles to kind of base my teaching off of those. I went into different articles, like articles from The Reading Teacher. I found an article on read alouds for bilingual children, as well as other articles in The Reading Teacher to kind of understand how to work with students from other cultures. I also went online to find different articles that addressed working with cultural students to truly understand what teacher behaviors and instructional strategies have been proven to work. One such teacher behavior is building relationships with students. I really didn't realize how important it was to build relationship with students who might have a different culture. Another one is to appreciate and accommodate similarities and differences of culture in your classroom. It's something that seems simple now, but it's something that I really hadn't taken into consideration until I researched and went into detail about it. This article also kind of talked about instructional strategies that I could use. So it talked about using review of post and coming up subjects. So I needed to review what we've learned, but also review what we're going to learn later on for students of different culture to really give them a chance to have multiple chances for exposure. I use these articles as kind of a leaping point to move into my student teaching, as well as to incorporate into lessons for my student teaching, which brings me to my fourth piece of evidence, a lesson from my student teaching. In my student teaching, we had to we taught students in kindergarten about celebrations. Typically these lessons were kind of about how celebrations were similar or different. So how a wedding might be similar or different from the 4th of July, or how New Year's Eve was different from the 4th of July. It really gave me the chance to take into consideration other cultures. So to start out with these set of lessons, I wanted to talk about with my students how to explain what's the same and what's different. So to explain same, I used a mirror to show when you're looking in a mirror, you see the same thing. You see the same face, you see your features, you see your characteristics, you see the same thing. With the window, I explained that when you looked through a window frame, so I had them create a little window frame with their hands. When you look through a window frame, you see different things. So if you look through your window frame at your partner, you're going to see how your partner is different from you. That was used to explain how something is the same and how something's different. When they came, I then had one of the students come up, and as a class we talked about how I was different from the student and how we were similar or the same between each other. From there we moved into more lessons about how celebrations were either similar or different between different cultures. So we talked about how Chinese New Year was different from an American New Year's. We talked about how an American wedding was different from a Turkish wedding. We talked about how different cultures were similar or different, and how those similarities and differences were okay and should be celebrated. From there, we moved into the final day of the overall lesson was an assessment. We had to assess kind of whether they understood what a celebration was. So we had them circle different pictures of what a celebration was and what a celebration wasn't. And then the final day was kind of a fluff piece where we could come up with an idea or a lesson to kind of teach differences and similarities. So with that, we chose to do a coloring activity where they had to create an image of what they thought they looked like. We wanted them to draw an image of what they thought they looked like and what was similar between them and their partner. We also wanted to talk about what was different between them and their partner. So we had them draw a picture on a crayon, and then once they drew a picture on their crayon, we took a picture of their faces and glued it onto the image, and then we glued it all together into a crayon box. This was really meant to assess whether they understood what was similar and different and what those words meant, as well as kind of give them a chance to express themselves in their forms of communication. That brings me to what my big ideas were. It's really important that for educators that are working with different cultures, they need to use a variety of instructional strategies. They need to use activities and strategies that cater to a bunch of different forms of communication so that each student feels like they're being met and their needs are being addressed. It's also important for an educator to provide feedback, rationale, as well as reviews of content so that they have multiple chances for exposure in the classroom. It kind of shows in my evidence how I've grown. So at the first piece of evidence in my math line or my math lesson, it was the baseline. I wasn't really good at it. I didn't do it intentionally. It was more of incidental and coincidental, and I didn't have the chance to really be intentional about it. The second piece of evidence was to show that while I was intentional about it, it was more of just given to me. I didn't independently think about it, and I didn't independently kind of come up with instruction that would work with my students. My third piece is to show how I researched different articles and went into detail about how I could grow as a teacher to work with my cultural students. And then my fourth piece of evidence is how I show that I was really intentional about it, how I wanted to be independent in working with students and independent in my thinking of how to meet the needs of my multicultural students. I really learned that it's important to take a lot into consideration when working with students from different cultures. You need to use a lot of different instructional strategies, need to use a lot of different teacher behaviors to meet the needs of all of you students. What I still want to learn, however, is how I can bring this to more of a school-wide idea. I want to incorporate this in a school-wide initiative as opposed to just my classroom or just a set of lessons. I want to show teachers that it can be intentional and that it needs to be intentional to meet all the needs of all of my students.